Thank you very much, Gerry, and it was a great privilege to work with Karen as I did, and many of you may or may not know she was chair of the STM Innovations Committee for a very long time, so it's entirely appropriate that we should be honouring her here. Rob and I worked together over a period of about 9 months, together with Anthony Watkinson, reviewing the previous edition of the report that was published in 2015. And we realised that we'd taken on a mammoth task. I think we hadn't realised quite how mammoth until we actually got to grips with it. It's now about 212 pages in length. It's got our 50th birthday logo on the front, but it has that lovely picture of Karen as the dedicatee on the back. But when we look over the last 12 years that I've been involved in creating an STM report, it's grown from about 35 pages to 212. And as you can see from the graph, the topics covered have remained roughly the same size relative to each other, but overall we're dealing now with publishing a book rather than a report. And I confidently predict, based upon the curve we can see developing there, that the next edition in 2021 is probably going to be way over 250 pages in length. God help us all, but there we are. Rob.
Well, just to pick out a few aspects of the report that we wanted to share with you. I mean, one point I'd make is all of the report is mainly drawing on existing sources and then lots of conversations with other people. So I don't think any of the three of us claim to be experts on everything covered in the report, but we generally knew who to speak to in order to get the latest information. So in terms of market sizing, journal revenues, this is using data from Outsell, are about $10 billion in 2017, growing about 2% a year, so fairly steady but sedate rate of growth. And that's part of a broader market of $25 billion a year for STM information. Within that, you've also got the STM books worth about $3 billion a year. E-books are now about a third of that, and e-books are growing substantially faster than the overall market, and at the same time, print is shrinking by about 4% a year. So clearly, there's a lot of ongoing shifts there. Geographically, in that overall market, the US continues to dominate. So that's of the 25 billion overall STM information market. US is 40%, Europe about a quarter, and you see the rest of the world there. Within the journals market, we think actually the US isn't quite such a large share there. And finally, in terms of the workforce, over 100,000 people globally, significant proportion in Europe, obviously many of those in the UK. And I think one of the things that we saw emerge between the last report and this one is a growing focus on looking at the diversity of that workforce, looking at pay inequality, just as we've seen in society at large. And again, that's something we've introduced for the first time in the 2018 report. Moving on to the journal market. I mean, I had a question on this morning. I think one of the things I'd say is there are no absolute figures for any of this. You know, we're having to make decisions about what sources we use. What we've tried to do is be as consistent as possible with the previous report so we can track changes over time. But using data from Ulrichs, about 33,000 active journals, English language journals, about 42,000 if you look at all languages, so clearly the majority are in English. Journal volumes growing about 5% per year, articles growing about 4% per year. So it's pretty clear, you know, the volume of activity of articles, as you will all know, is growing faster than the revenues. So people are having to do more for the same or only slight increases in money.
It is worth saying, though, that the uptick on journal growth at 5% is slightly unusual compared with the long-term trend. The long-term trend for nearly 3 centuries was about 3.25% per annum. So we're not sure whether this is a real uptick or whether it's a data collection issue.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'd like to talk a bit now about the global landscape, where perhaps the biggest headline of the report lies. And the data we're showing you here comes from the National Science Board, their 2018 edition, but you could have found similar data from Scopus and World of Science and many other data sets. And the headline item is that China has become the leading producer of scholarly papers annually in the world since probably 2016, since a lot of the data has to be collected and analysed from the past. You can't really get a snapshot of where we are in 2018, but suffice it to say, it's probably advanced beyond that point. So it was always the US followed by China for the last couple of years, and now it's China followed by the US. The other really big change is the sudden appearance in the top 5 of India. And that obviously reflects on the huge amount of money that's being invested in R&D in India. And I don't think we should put too much emphasis on the changes in position lower down, which are partly affected by the growth in these 2 big numbers going up. And obviously we have to then readjust the percentages for the whole universe. But it is probably noteworthy that Japan continues to decline. And that also is probably a result of the relative reduction in GDP spending on research in Japan. Do you want to do that?
Yeah, and I think what you see here is just that trend played out graphically. So, the lines going down are the developed world. The lines going up are the developing world. We are seeing a global shift of the center of gravity in publishing. The EU collectively is still the largest producer, but obviously when you break that down by country, a long way behind the US and particularly China these days. I think the next graph here is really just to illustrate how much it depends what data source you look at when gathering this information. So this is courtesy of Eric Archambault of Science Metrics, and the point here is, we often quote figures for journals or figures for articles. In this case, if you look at that trend over time in terms of the number of articles indexed, if you look at OneFinder, which is Eric's own database, or you look at Dimensions, you get a much higher figure, you get higher levels of growth than if you look at Web of Science or Scopus. So what we've seen emerge, and this is really, again, since the last report, is these web-scale discovery tools, so the likes of Dimensions, OneFinder, also Wisdom AI, that are going out and harvesting huge amounts of information, and to some extent providing a different perspective than Web of Science and Scopus. And we heard earlier from Jan about the value of the quality of the curated databases in terms of Scopus and Web of Science. So we are starting to get 2 different perspectives, or more than 2 different perspectives on what is going on.
In terms of researchers themselves, it's pretty clear that the core motivations for publishing have not really altered, not really even since the first report, and probably a lot earlier. Work that largely comes from the pioneering studies of Carol Tenopir definitely are showing stabilisation in reading patterns. There had been a slight decline in the last report, but it's now back up to the figure that it had before at about 250 articles per annum, although that varies a lot between different disciplines. Search dominates over browse, but again, that varies a lot by discipline. And very, very little time is actually spent on publisher websites. There's continuing innovation in peer review, but it's probably worth saying that the vast majority of people using the system are satisfied, and where there are areas of dissatisfaction, it tends to be in clinical medicine, and there may be good reasons for why we notice that.
I think on technology, these are the themes that we've been discussing today and yesterday, so we'll be familiar. But data of all forms, so both data as a research output, but also data on articles, on the scholarly communication process, becoming ever more significant. RDAs, the Research Data Alliance, playing an important role there. Also, DataCite and Scholix as really important developments. I mentioned the web-scale discovery tools, so I think we see them becoming ever more significant in terms of providing more visibility as to what's going on, different perspectives. We hear a lot about AI. I think AI is now becoming a viable tool with real applications. Blockchain, a lot of excitement around that, still very hard to tell, very early stage. And I think preprint servers, we've seen that develop very rapidly beyond sort of maths and physics into a number of other disciplines. And I think that's creating a number of challenges, raising a number of questions for publishers and for the research community as to how to respond to that growth, how to develop norms and guidelines around that.
In terms of business models, aggregation is still the norm. The bundle model is under pressure from librarians, as I'm sure you all are aware. But having said that, big deals still remain important, but they are increasingly tied to OA and offsetting arrangements. Access to STM content remains at a high, which I think we should be constantly emphasising when we talk. The last time we measured these figures, it was about 2.5 billion downloads globally, but we're pretty sure that figure is a gross underestimate, and it's probably topping 3 billion at this point. And the most commonly cited barriers to access are cost and pricing related, not entirely unsurprisingly. And it is worth noting that the collaboration which STM is really proud to be involved in, Research for Life, provides free and very low cost access to about 8,500 institutions in 118 different countries to nearly 20,000 journals. And this isn't just about free access, it's also about ensuring there's capacity building in those countries, as well as teaching them how to use the materials to their best and to become part of the publishing world themselves.
So I think on open access, this is another of those questions where the answer is, well, what answer do you want? You know, and one of the things we've explored in some detail in the report is the different sources, the different estimates of levels of open access. I think what we've tried to do is adopt a terminology that's become increasingly common around looking at what's legal open access, what's sustainable open access, and on that measure, we think it's about a third of content globally is now open access, so about 15 to 20% as gold open access, so on the publisher's platform, a further 10 to 15%, again, perhaps on the publisher's platform as delayed OA or self-archived copies. Notably, obviously, as many of you will know, the market revenues from open access remain a much lower share of the total than the proportion of articles, partly because some of that open access is provided through non-market mechanisms, but also simply as the revenues per article are, on average, substantially lower than the subscription model. And I think this just illustrates the shift in publishing models. So drawing on the Scopus data set, just showing that there's a very clear shift away from subscriptions, but they still remain a substantial proportion of journal publishing models globally. Gold open access, APC based, is still less than 10% in 2016, although growing rapidly. Actually, the kind of platinum OA or diamond OA, so that's gold open access where no APC is charged. It gets a lot of attention, but it's still a fairly small proportion of the total, and it's not actually growing very rapidly either, so about 5% of the total.
So trends since the last report. We commented back in 2015 about the mega journals and the role that they might or might not be having. They remain an established means of outlet, but they're not a dominant form, as at one point people thought they might be. There's been an increase in the number of titles, but this is more linked to increases in research output in general, rather than increasing appetite for these very large publications. We're seeing a move from open access to open science. Open science, for those of you who are not aware, is the combination of open access, data, researcher education, researcher management, citizen science, and a number of related open investigation techniques. And we ought to emphasise that when we use in STM the words open science, we also mean open research, which is the way that the arts, humanities and social sciences think about it as well. The impact of social networks continues to grow, but it's still way, way behind where things are in consumer media. And there are many reasons for that, which we don't have time to go in for. Publishers are increasingly seen as workflow and analytics businesses. And so they're servicing many different parts of researcher workflow rather than the traditional acquisition and editorial development that we've seen in the past. So what about the future? There are some constants in a very fast-changing world. The Oldenburgian functions, that's to say the traditional journal functions of registration, dissemination, certification and archive, remain strong, and therefore the reasons why authors in particular publish are also remarkably constant, and they're constant from what was the case in the paper world to what is also the case now in the online world. There's a bit more of a focus on trust and transparency. We've seen, as we indicated earlier, the shifting of a centre of gravity to the east. This is already happening in terms of output, but there's clearly, I think, in some areas a bit of a deficit in terms of Chinese peer reviewers, although there isn't a deficit in Chinese papers. We've seen increasing emphasis on data and open science, and it's clear that the open access transition is continuing. How that pans out is still not entirely clear. As Rob said earlier, there's obviously downward pressure on per article costs, and there is momentum for increasing uptake, particularly as this is being driven to a certain extent by the views of funders that many of you will be familiar with the recent proposals on Plan S and Coalition S. It's not clear whether the top journals themselves are going to be in a position to convert, not least because estimates of what APCs they'd have to charge come out as probably higher than most individuals would want to contemplate. But we are seeing a growth in open access in books, particularly in educational resources. There's an accelerating pace to the market in all types of technology, which I'm sure nobody at this seminar of STM is going to be unfamiliar with. And we don't see ourselves as necessarily predicting the future, but I'll let Rob finish off with this.
Well, I think this is why we don't see ourselves as predicting the future. Many have tried and failed. So we can certainly discern some of the trends, but I'm sure come 2021 there'll be one or two things that take us by surprise.
Before we close, I just want to acknowledge our co-author, Anthony, who's at the back there. Can you give us a wave, Anthony? Thank you all very much, and if there's time for questions, we're happy to take them.
Thank you.